From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show.
This episode of Fragmented is brought to you by educative.io. Now, there are a lot of websites out there that help you teach programming courses, but one thing most of them tend to do is focus on video, so they're all video-based. Educative.io takes a very different approach. To them, they go the text-based route. That means you don't necessarily have to scrub back and forth to follow along. Say, you're going through a video and someone just blows past a certain section, and then you're going back, wait, what did they say exactly? And you rewind, then open up a notepad to take notes. You don't have to do any of that with educative.io because it's text-based. Think of it as almost reading a book. If you're reading a book, it's pretty easy to skim back or double back and just easily skim through. In addition to a whole bunch of amazing courses out there, here's the kicker. If you're an Android developer, they just launched a killer Android course called Modern Android App Development. It's perfect. Just go back, refresh your memory, and go through the educative course. It has a fully functional live Android emulator, so you can actually create and deploy your app right from within the course. You'll get a live link to the app that you can share with friends or even, put up on your portfolio if you start looking for jobs. Check it out now and get an additional 10% off your purchase if you go through this special link, educative.io/fragmented. Once again, that's educative.io, EDUCATIVE, in case you didn't catch the spelling, educative.io/fragmented. Thanks again for sponsoring this show, Educative.
Kaushik, another day here in quarantine land. How you doing?
Pretty good. All things considered, it goes in waves. Some days are okay. You're like, oh, it's not bad. Then some days are just, oh my God, what is happening to the world?
Exactly. So, but, I think one of the things that I've found comforting over the past 7 weeks, I'm day 45 for me. So whatever that is the ability to listen to some of my favorite podcasts. And so I'm very grateful for the fact that they exist, and I'm happy that we can be there for other folks who listen to our podcast. And if you are listening to our podcast and you're in quarantine or whatever, or lockdown, thanks for listening. We appreciate it, and we hope we're providing some value for you and getting some good information.
I mean, speaking about good shows, one of the shows that really I thought was a good one and the one that we enjoyed doing was the one with Leland.
Yeah,
if you remember,
great.
On Jetpack Compose. Mm-hmm. And so we thought, let's lift people's spirits up and bring Leland back to the show. And so without further ado, we have Leland today. Welcome to the show.
Hey guys, how's it going? I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, welcome back to the show, I should say.
Yeah, welcome back.
Yeah.
So Leland, obviously in this episode, we thought we'll definitely touch on Compose, but the thing I wanted to point out to folks is just one of these, in the last week, I happened to watch your talk at Android Dev Summit 2019. We'll post a link to that in the show notes. And I must say that was one of the best talks I've seen. It just, you take relatively complex concepts. You start off with the easy stuff, and then you kill that in that you present it really well, and then you talk about some really complex things and how Jetpack Compose was inspired by these concepts, and how you apply those as well, right? And I must say this is one of my favorite talks, the ones you gave at Dev Summit. So we were hoping maybe we can pick your brains a little, but also in general, we're really inspired by the way you operate as a software engineer. And in this podcast, we're trying to branch out and also talk about these things and how can we give our listeners more information so that they can become not just better Android developers, but better developers in general. So we thought we'll pick your brains a little today.
Yeah. Wow. Starting off with such high praise. I appreciate that. That talk was a lot of fun to give. It was, it was kind of crazy, actually. It started off as what was supposed to be a 20-minute talk, and like 2 days before the conference, they're like, "Hey, do you think you can fill 40 minutes?" And I'm like, sure. But yeah, I mean, I talking at conferences is something that I really enjoy doing, and I don't know if I'm particularly good at it, but it's something I'd like to get better at. But I do really enjoy the process and enjoy explaining concepts to people. I think that it's one of the things that really helps me. Like, I think being able to explain a concept is one of the best ways to learn that concept. And that may sound weird, like learn the concept that I'm kind of preaching, but it is like a really good way to formulate a really kind of solid mental model in your head is to try and explain it as simply as possible to other people.
I mean, stop it. You are amazing at giving talks. So I will start by saying that. But where did that come from, if I may ask? Because, I mean, again, you work at Google right now, and before this, you were at Airbnb, right? So clearly there's something that you've developed which has given you like a strong software engineering background, right? You talked about like giving talks as something that you liked. Where did that come? Where did that stem from? Is that something that you've always just wanted to do? Or did you notice that you started with like some talks and then that helped you understand the concepts better? Like, where does that aspect come from?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I think I've always kind of wanted to be a teacher of sorts. But before going into software engineering, I was actually very strongly considering becoming a professor of physics.
Oh, wow.
But like all through college, for instance, I did a lot of like TAing and like homework sessions and stuff like that. And I really enjoy explaining things to people. And teaching people in that way, and so that's sort of like a natural outlet to do that in the context of software engineering. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of, ever since I started doing software professionally, I tried to do some talks, but I think until the past couple of years, those were largely kind of unnoticed talks that local meetups and things like that. And then I, started speaking at some bigger venues, but, public speaking, I think, has actually always been a bit difficult for me. And so it's one of the things that I'd like to get better at, but, teaching, on the other hand, has always come naturally. And so the best way for me to give a good talk, I think, is to just forget that there's, a bunch of people watching and more just think of it like I'm trying to explain it to one person.
Yes, exactly. That's something I also believe in heavily. It doesn't matter if there's, 5 people there or 500. To me, I'm the same way. If I can teach something to one person and they leave and they get something out of it, then my job's done and I'm happy.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So I try to think with Jetpack Compose, if I were to like build like a library like Jetpack Compose, that would be pretty like crazy, right? So how do you like get yourself into a position where you're like, you can start to address like these complex things? Because I watched the talk, right? And you talk about like crazy things. You talk about principles like cohesion versus like coupling. You talk about, gap buffers. You talk about like all these things. And where did you start? Like, how did all of that start? Mm-hmm. Like, did it start with you just being like a computer science student, like learning these concepts? Was it like on the job? How do you develop that interest? If someone wants to become Leland, give us like give us like the roadmap.
Well, so I've never actually formally studied any computer science.
Wow.
I studied math and physics in college, and programming was always sort of a hobby of mine, and it was only sort of around college time for me where it started to become more of a profession, and that was kind of when I really developed a love for it, and kind of decided to go that direction career-wise. I will say, I think that like early on in my career, it was all about just building things. I was very product focused, and I had a small startup at one point, and like I really just liked getting my hands dirty and like building things, and one of the things that sort of came out of that as we started getting other employees and things like that, and it was a code base that, you know, more than just one person was touching, I started caring a lot more about architecture and, you know, understandability of code and maintainability and all of these other things that become much more important when you're developing software that is iterated on for years to come, and many people are you know, tweaking and things like that. And so I became, I guess, like obsessed with building things that not only worked, but were sort of elegant in my mind and were things that other people would be able to very quickly understand and contribute to themselves without me having to walk them through the nuance of the code base and things like that. And I think that naturally evolved. It wasn't really until I started working for Airbnb, where I was working for a company of like more than 15 developers, where these types of things were more and more important. And so at Airbnb, I made the choice to actually move away from product and like work on, you know, what they would call an infrastructure team, where instead of working on the product directly, I would instead build things that other developers at the company would then use to build product. And so that just sort of, you know, built on itself. And all of a sudden, you know, I was now taking my experience as a product developer and trying to figure out all of the ways that I could make everyone's life easier, and everyone who is working on product to like have that be a delightful part of their job, where it was just so easy to express what they wanted. And so those are the types of things that I really enjoy building APIs, where they kind of just get out of people's way, and then you can just build what you know that you want to build, and you don't need to figure out how. It just sort of happens.
Nice. So the one thing I wanted to ask is, so when you started on this path, right? We recently did like an episode on like Polyglot programmers. And so did you start off like with, where you said product development, right? So was it a more generic thing? Did you start off with just like any language or like whatever you needed to build a product? Or did you, after that, move to a shift, did you shift your focus towards mobile? You know, at like Airbnb, you said like the platform thing, right? Did that involve you jumping across different platforms? Yeah, what are your thoughts in general about like just becoming, you know, a better software engineer in general, like, and how that relates to like different languages, going deep versus like breadth? Some thoughts around that?
Yeah, I was actually just talking to someone about this the other day, but one of the sort of characteristics I value most in a software engineer is sort of the kind of fearlessness to just dive into any problem, or any, whatever it may be, you know, any code base or anything that's unfamiliar to them, you know, to get something done or to learn how something works. And you know, I've really noticed there definitely there are people that like distinctly don't have that quality, and like some people that just like to find their comfort zone and really stay in that spot as long as they can. And as soon as something outside of that comfort zone would be like useful, they kind of they get stuck. And so I've just always been a firm believer that, like, you know, if you want to fix something or change something, or make something better, or learn how something works, like just go do it and like dive in and figure that out. And yeah, so I've just tried to do that for most of my career. And a lot of times, you know, that starts off as just like a small side project, or just like a, you know, one line change in a code base. But then all of a sudden I see, you know, 20 other things that might be worth doing. So
I really like that idea of that fearless programming thing. And to give a context, right, I think I was definitely one of those people who was like not very comfortable in like doing different things. I've told the story before, but I've been like a web programmer. I started out with Java, Spring development, like all that good jazz. I moved towards Rails, and that itself was like, we're doing something really crazy here, and let's just stick to that. It wasn't until I joined my first startup where they're like, Java, we have an Android app, we need someone to look at it, just do it, right? And that was so hard. Like I was almost, held at gunpoint to do it because there was no option. Like you're a startup, there's like just 3 people, you need to help out, right? And so I think that experience, also building on what you said, right? Like once you realize you can do it once, it's just like liberating. So I would encourage folks like who think like, oh yeah, I feel like this is my comfort zone. Like if you've only done mobile development, definitely, that fearlessness helps. And I can like attest to the fact that it's only like the first time that you have that fear. Once you break through that barrier, it tends to become easier, right? Like after that, you're like, yeah, I've done this once, might as well try. Like, what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, well, and it's really nice to kind of demystify things. Like there are things that you imagine as being extremely complicated or magic, and as soon as you dig into the code base, you realize it's just like anything else. And once you understand it, then, it's like pulling back the curtain.
I'll be honest with you. That's exactly how I felt about Jetpack Compose. Like, because I was like, what is this this magic that's happening? What are they doing? Right. And again, like your talk, you did this really well too, by the way. You split the talk into 2, right? The first half was more like, this is the API, this is how it works, like some more tactical things around like how Jetpack Compose works. But in the latter half, you talked about, and yeah, I liked that you prefaced that portion saying, you don't need to know this to be able to use Jetpack Compose, but knowing it is like, it satisfies an intellectual curiosity. But I would also say like just knowing how it works, like demystification is so important, because then you feel comfortable exploring the code versus just like copy pasting snippets that you find, on Stack Overflow or Google, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's sort of 2 camps. There's people that will need to use Compose just because they're thrown into a situation and, maybe their company is using it or something like that. And they just want to get the job done, and they don't necessarily need to understand exactly how it works or anything like that. And it shouldn't be necessary to understand all of those details in order to use it. And we're really trying to make it an intuitive, understandable API. But at the same time, there's some interesting things going on, and there are people that's exactly what they crave, right? Is understanding, exactly how this works, and they want to, become an expert in the area and things like that. And so I at being someone who's actually working on it, I enjoy sort of satisfying that intellectual curiosity. And so, I mean, some of it is selfish, but I also know that other people will definitely want to know as well.
Oh, for sure. For example, like, just like jumping into some of the Jetpack Compose stuff, right? Like you talked about the concept of like cohesion versus coupling, right? And I loved like how you sort of explained that, like you have 2 modules. I have a 2-part question. One is like, maybe you can like help us, like, if you can just like do for our listeners a quick sort of explanation around that specific idea. But also like what I'm more curious about is when you started to, where does that come from, right? Like, is this a concept you've encountered before, and then you realized, oh, that's what it is, and so I'm going to apply it with Jetpack Compose? Or like, did you go like from the get-go, which came first, right? Or was it like more like a mechanism of explaining it, and you're like, oh, we have these problems, to solve this problem, I'm doing this thing, and then you relate it to the idea of cohesion versus coupling? Or was it like, from the get-go, I'm going to build Jetpack Compose, I know these concepts exist, this is what I want, so let's do it this way? Does that make sense?
Right, totally. Well, it's funny. I didn't fully realize this until after I gave the talk, but someone mentioned that Pete Hunt, who was one of the people who was instrumental early on in the React community, gave a talk on exactly these concepts, and I remembered the talk, and I remember when I saw that talk for the first time, it was one of the most fundamental shifts in my thinking since I had started programming. And so it really stuck with me, and those sort of concepts and ways of thinking have been something that I've sort of been using in my daily list of jargon, that I use when explaining or talking to things about other people about programming, and so one of the things that was important for React early on was kind of explaining how this type of programming doesn't necessarily fly in the face of some of these established patterns and practices, such as separation of concerns. And so he did a really good job of explaining that, and I kind of emulated that here in this talk, which was really kind of showing that separation of concerns is really about this balance between coupling and cohesion, and that may be a less confusing way to phrase it and to think about it, because and actually I think I mentioned this last time I was on this podcast, but I think it's easy to fall into this trap where you think that just because something is in a different file that it is separate, and that, in my opinion, is one of the things that's happening right now in the Android ecosystem with XML layout files, and which may be very intertwined with UI related logic that happens in separate files that are Java or Kotlin files. And I think that this happens quite often once you reach any sort of realistic level of complexity in an app. You're going to have a fair amount of UI related logic that you're going to write in code, be that Java or Kotlin. And you're going to start tweaking things that happen in your layout file. And the sort of previous kind of way of thinking was that, well, those are separate concerns. Defining your layout and tweaking your layout are separate concerns, and they're really not. There might be business-related logic that ought to be separated in terms of the UI and presenting that like business-related data and some of the business-related logic. Like that separation is natural and good. But there's some logic that's just naturally UI-related logic, and what happens is you end up getting a lot of coupling between these different things. So your layout file and your activity file, maybe, or something like that. And so the general premise is that instead of thinking of separating your concerns, one way to think about it instead is to minimize the amount of coupling, implicit coupling or explicit, in your app, and increase the amount of cohesion, or maximize the amount of cohesion. And so cohesion can kind of be defined as like these sort of bits of logic that kind of naturally fit together. They're cohesive as a unit, and so those things can kind of be coupled in their own little corner of a programming unit, which I used module as the word. And then you end up minimizing the amount of sort of dependencies between these things by having these well-defined units of cohesive logic. And what I have found is that this declarative component-based programming model ends up making that really, really easy. And this is one of those things that it's sort of hard to explain to people if they haven't written an application of size in this style. But you start to get this real natural sense of where these lines of separation should be drawn between these different components. And I think almost the more important thing is that when you do it this way, when you're using code to write all of these units, there's not this there's not this like forced upon layer of separation that is brought by the actual language or technology you're using. And so if like everything is in Kotlin, for instance, then it is really easy to refactor those lines of separation and to move one bit of logic into another bit of logic, and using the kind of units of abstraction that programming languages already provide you, and namely the function, right? So Compose is built almost entirely out of functions, and it like that ends up being an incredibly useful primitive to create these lines of separation very, very easily, and more importantly, making refactoring those lines of separation just as easy. And that's like, I think that kind of in a nutshell is like one of the reasons I think this programming model is so delightful whenever you start using it.
Was there a particular point in your career where you kind of had the aha moment about kind of everything you just explained? Was there an experience, a platform or anything like that you worked with where you're kind of like, wow, this is the way it should be done? Or was it just kind of something you evaluated or developed over time?
I'm not sure there was like an aha moment, but it was, I mean, definitely if you have written a few apps like in this style, the second you try to go back, you just feel, I mean, it feels like your legs have been chopped off underneath you. It's like it's like, how do you do this any other way? It's so much better. But yeah, I don't know. I think that, I've been involved in like a lot of refactorings of doing things in one style and moving to this style, and a lot of code review and things like that maybe has allowed me to stress that muscle and grow it over time. But yeah, I don't know.
React Native is like one of those things that like open this up, right? A lot of like what we see today, like with the whole reactive sort of like models like stemmed from that idea, right? So I feel like that was definitely an interesting sort of jumping off point for a lot of us. Going back to what you said, just a quick follow-up, like that was the thing that really got me interested, right? Because the concept you mentioned of mixing UI and mixing UI logic inside like your core business logic, right? It was funny because I remember, I don't know if it was like live data or view bindings, it's one of them. But I remember like when that happened, like there was a big outcry, right? Because people were like, oh my God, we're mixing the two. We're mixing business logic with view logic, right? And I mean, for like different reasons, we won't dive into that. But I noticed a similar sort of argument being brought up with Jetpack Compose, right? Where they're like, wait, aren't we like mixing the two things together? But I think like you put it well, right? Like, there is the actual language sort of a difference, like writing in XML versus writing in Kotlin. And it makes decoupling easier if it's all in the same language. Like there's no doubt about that, right? Like working with one language versus working with another. And then again, it's the same thing. If you use your core units, like you have like functions, using a lot of that stuff, it is, yeah, I think in the end, it's like a business model, right? Like it is a mindset, not a business model. It's a mindset that you adapt to like improve your code as against, just having like a dogmatic approach saying like, nope, not going to mix this, not going to have this. Yeah, I did think that was pretty interesting, at least at that point. So another thing I wanted to ask is like, there's like these concepts, right? Like there's, and I know there isn't necessarily a definition for this, like the reactive sort of mode, but in your talk, you also talked about the idea of like having a declarative style of building logic, which is what like Jetpack Compose is like aiming towards, versus the traditional form, which is like imperative, right? I wanted to ask what your thoughts were about like this style of building things, right? Like declarative versus imperative. The last time I heard like a big conversation around this was around the whole functional versus like imperative aspect, right? So where does all that fit in?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I like to try and point out is that imperative is not a bad word, right? Like, I think that there's a tendency for people to get really excited about these types of frameworks. And, we call them declarative, which is, for the most part correct. But I think that people start associating, declarative good, imperative bad. And I don't think that's necessarily true or how you should be thinking about it. Declarative, one way to think about declarative versus imperative is that declarative is like strictly less things to describe. If something is declarative, you're leaving this sort of how left up to the framework to decide. Whereas in an imperative style, it's much more like the framework saying, I'm not smart. I'm letting you tell me exactly how to do it. And so when you have a declarative system, you're kind of by definition, you're giving up some control. You're relinquishing some control of how something happens to the underlying system. And sometimes that dramatically simplifies how you write the code, which is good. But other times it makes implementing very nuanced things more difficult. And so this is like one of those things, like animation is something where it can be very difficult to describe certain animations in a declarative system, because one of the things that a declarative UI framework is typically doing is saying, I'm going to take care of the state transitions for you. So you just tell me what state A is and state B, and I'll figure out how to update everything to be in state B now. And which is great, but a lot of times you want to animate from state A to state B. And so then the system has to allow you to specify exactly how it's doing that thing, where the whole point earlier was to not tell it how to do that thing. And so that's like one of the challenges is there are certain pockets of UI development that actually end up being harder in a declarative system. And so we have to think really hard about the right APIs to expose to allow people to do those things when they need to, but not removing or like going back on all the gains that we had made and making the common case so much simpler.
That makes sense. Another question I had around like the talk that you gave, right? And this was something that's just out of curiosity. You mentioned this whole data structure called gap buffers, right? We probably won't go into like the details because explaining that is probably something that's best done either just watching the talk or like reading a blog post or something. So we'll make sure to add links to that. Mm-hmm. The question I had around that was like, you mentioned you didn't necessarily have a computer science background, right? So when you started to implement Jetpack Compose, right? Is that something that you just like researched and found out, oh, this is like something that text editors use and therefore like, let me try to see if this works? Or was it more around, you knew of this concept already and then you're like, oh, that's like the perfect idea for this? Like, how do you think about these things? Because the question I find sometimes thinking, right, is like when I'm coming up with like the implementation or something, usually I'm like, well, is there a data structure for this? Should I go research this? Or should I just start off with something and then gradually, as I get a better understanding, maybe then I can start looking. How did you approach that specifically for Jetpack Compose, right? Did you always know that, okay, gap buffers is something I want to use? Or I know it's like specific, but I'm hoping that the answer can help us understand how to approach these kind of problems.
Yeah. Well, so I guess one thing that's very important to bring up is that I am not a sole developer building Jetpack Compose on my own or anything like that. And so there are a lot of people working on Compose that do have computer science backgrounds and are very, very smart. And this is one particular example where when I started working on Jetpack Compose, I didn't know what a gap buffer was. A colleague of mine, Chuck Jazdowski, who's brilliant. He's one of the three people that are on the compiler and runtime team with me. And my initial implementation of the runtime was backed sort of by a linked list like approach, which is very similar to how, for instance, React and Flutter work. And so we had this implementation, and we were just talking because while that underlying implementation was kind of the same, our overall API surface has some pretty staggering differences between other frameworks like React and SwiftUI and Flutter and things like that. And so Chuck was kind of the one that first made the realization that, hey, if we used a gap buffer, a lot of this, like a gap buffer would actually work very, very well in this type of approach. And when he first mentioned it, I was like, I don't even know what that is. so you need to explain it to me. And then he kind of explained to me how it would work. And I was just immediately like, oh, this is awesome. Like that would be really cool. And then, he went and sort of implemented the first implementation of, what has kind of lived on to today of the runtime that is backed by this gap buffer like data structure. And it was I don't know if it was, we weren't on AOSP yet, so I don't know if the CL is in the commit history or anything, but it was one of the most beautiful commits I've ever looked at. So it's, but yeah, so I don't have a computer science background. I'm someone who, can definitely nerd out and look at a lot of things like this and read up on things and maybe, I can make those leaps, but that doesn't mean that, that this type of background isn't important. And these are exactly the types of things where someone's background and experience like Chuck was incredibly valuable to the project overall.
So that's a good learning, surround yourself with smart people. Well, what are your thoughts on like mentorship and like trying to find people who, how do you find the people who help you learn more,
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have like a great answer to it, I don't think. I think that whenever I have found people that are really good and smart and intelligent, I try to work with them. But as far as finding them, I don't think that's like an easy thing to do. Some of the people at Google are incredibly talented. And so, Google's a great company to go and find those people at. But I assure you, they're not just at Google, they're all over the place. So, yeah.
Absolutely. You don't want to take like too much of your time, but I would be completely remiss if I didn't ask this question, right? What is the state of Jetpack Compose today, right? I've seen like a lot of demos, and I'll also throw this, I'm sure you looked at it too, Leland, but did you see like the Doom fire recreation thing that someone did in Jetpack Compose?
Yeah, I did.
So like that was interesting. So I do see a lot of Jetpack Compose being used in the wild. Obviously, I know, like you've mentioned, that it isn't prime time ready yet, right? But what exactly is the state of Jetpack Compose today, right? Like, how much of it can you like let us know? Like, is this something that we should start like looking at? Should we start building like toy applications on the side with the Jetpack Compose? Like, what are your thoughts around how we should be looking at, the progress of Jetpack Compose?
Yeah, that's a good question. Definitely since the last time we talked, a ton of progress has been made, and the overall shape of a lot of APIs has changed dramatically. And that's actually, it's a pretty cool thing to be able to say. We open source Compose at a very early state, and it's been really, really helpful to the overall progress of Compose because we no longer have to sort of ideate in a vacuum. And a little while ago at ADS, I guess, we started this developer preview program where we actually went ahead and put releases of Compose in the state that it was in on Maven, so that people could start playing with it. And so since we've done that, we've started doing releases every 2 weeks, which is like a pretty healthy cadence, I think. And also there are ways that you can try Compose at any snapshot build of Compose in the public. So you can really go directly to master if you want. But it's been really helpful because there's this small cohort of people, these early adopters, who have really started using Compose in big ways, despite the fact that it's in a dev preview, and they know that. I mean, these are people that are willing to every 2 weeks go through a small migration process from all of the breaking changes that we've made, which we're very lucky to have these types of dedicated early adopters. But it's also been extremely helpful as a channel for free feedback. And a lot of the changes that we've made have been from direct feedback that we've received from people trying Compose out. And it's been really fun to see that kind of change, and also like see people kind of following along and seeing just like how their understanding of everything changes, and certain API choices where people get really excited and stuff like that. It's just been really awesome to see.
That's awesome. And the current state of Jetpack Compose, like, is that still like to be decided? Do you feel like the APIs are still like undergoing some change before prime time?
Yeah, so Jetpack Compose is still in a developer preview mode, and really until we hit beta, you can expect that there will be a healthy amount of breaking changes regularly.
Right.
And that's just really important, because we're talking about a very large API surface area. Where us being able to get this feedback in and make changes without as much ceremony around those changes really helps us get it into a state where all of the users that do start using it at the beta state, they're going to have a much more polished product to be able to use.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's just like even like looking at the talk, right? You're basically trying to build the equivalent of like text view, constraint layouts, like list views, all that stuff. I imagine it would take some time to like get there. But even so, I think that's the important question I feel that a lot of us want answered is like, when do I know that it's okay to start using Jetpack Compose, right? Because a lot of us going in to like our organizations now, like we're super excited about Jetpack Compose, but obviously using Jetpack Compose now in a production app is definitely not a good idea, right? At least that's definitely my opinion. You want it to at least to reach beta before you even consider it. And even then, like, depending on like your use case and applications, you want to be extremely careful, right? But so I think that's like really helpful to know that, okay, when it hits beta, that's when you can really start playing with this and start using it, right? So that's good to know.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't have anything sort of new to announce or add in terms of timeline, but you can go and look at the changes we're making, and the team's working very hard, and there's a lot of really good stuff coming in. So we'll definitely let you know when it is ready.
That's awesome, Leland. Thank you so much again for your time today. This is this is always so much fun.
Yeah, thank you. This was a blast.
If folks want to like pepper you with more questions, what's a good way to do that?
Yeah, so I haven't been as active on Twitter lately, but I still will be pretty responsive if you message me on Twitter. That's probably a quick way to get my attention. So my Twitter handle is @IntelligiBabble.
We'll make sure to throw like that in our show notes as well. But Don, if folks want to see what you're up to during this period, what's a good place to do that?
The best place is going to be on Instagram or on Twitter. Same handle, just Don Felker. And what about you, Kaushik? How can they get a hold of you?
I am Kaushik Gopal on Twitter and on Instagram and most other places.
Fantastic.
Thank you all so much for listening. We will catch you in the next episode. I'd like to take this chance and thank the sponsor for this episode, Educative.io. There are a lot of websites out there that offer programming courses, but Educative.io has a really special text-based interface that helps folks learn faster and more efficiently. Check out the very new course they have for Android developers called Modern Android App Development. If you use the special link we have here, educative.io/fragmented, then you get an additional 10% off your purchase. So remember to use that special link. Once again, it's educative.io/fragmented. Thanks again for sponsoring the show. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. Sarah the Amazing Jackson from the Spec Network helps with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme and ad music is by the national recording artist Blueprint from Weightless Recordings. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.